One of the scribes came near and heard them disputing with one another. And seeing that Jesus answered them well, he asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Then the scribe said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that he is one, and besides him there is no other. And to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. This is much more important than all the burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that the scribe answered wisely, he said to him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." After that, no one dared to ask him any question.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? I'm so glad you know that. You know this guy, yeah? Fred Rogers. I learned this morning some of the youth and children don't know Fred Rogers, and I forgot to ask them, maybe they know Daniel Tiger? Daniel Tiger is a successor of Fred Rogers. This man was a cultural icon in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, into the 90s. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister, not everyone knows that, who accepted a call to evangelism through this new media called public television. And his work centered around the education of very young children, preschool-age children. He worked to teach them the values of inclusion, of self-worth, of how to de-escalate their anger and tense situations, about what it meant to be a neighbor, what it meant to live in a neighborhood where each person was unique and valued and never left alone. Beginning in 1968, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood became a television classic, a very simple show with a very simple premise. And he wasn't afraid to address the very difficult issues of the time. In the very first week of the series, in 1968, he addressed the issues of the Vietnam War. He talked about violence and he talked about conflicts. Later, he addressed racism. He addressed assassination. He taught the world that seeing the world through the eyes of a child is the most innocent and pure way to be in the world. But he knew that our children needed care and compassion so that they could grow up to be full citizens in this neighborhood of ours. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood affected and touched generations of children and perhaps generations of parents and grandparents, and that legacy continues. There's a documentary film out about him now. Have you seen it? It's called Won't You Be My Neighbor? Marion tipped me off to it several weeks ago. And on the night before I departed for Germany, I said to my darling husband, we have to go see this movie. And he says, you have to pack. And I said, we have to go see this movie. If you haven't seen it, I strongly recommend it to you. I also strongly recommend that you take a box of Kleenexes with you. From the very opening scene, the trolley is taken out of a box and placed on the tracks to the land of make-believe, and you may just have a tear in your eye. And by the end of the film, when the screen fades to black, you will be surrounded by a community of sniffles, of a lot of adults trying to hold back a sob, because what a story. The life's work of a man who inspired us to live as better neighbors, that inspired us to embrace the idea of a neighborhood. And of course, because he was a Presbyterian minister, this idea of neighbor and neighborhood wasn't unfounded from our own Christian tradition, right? The biblical witness tells us that the very work of God is to live in such a way as that we love our neighbors as ourselves. And so the text that we have this morning from the Gospel of Mark helps us to fully understand, through Jesus' eyes, what it means to be one who loves our neighbor. So we have this little story, and in the context of Mark, Jesus has begun his ministry. He has been healing and teaching and speaking in parables. And there's been a lot of tension and debate with the religious authorities of his day. He has arrived in Jerusalem. You remember the story, the triumphant entry, all the hosannas. And another argument ensues with the religious people. And a scribe comes to him after one of these debates, not to challenge him, not to trap him, but to ask a question that opens a dialogue. The young scribe says, "Tell me, what is the first of the commandments?" And Jesus spoke from his own faith tradition. He quoted the Hebrew Bible, and he says, "The first is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength.' The second is this, 'You shall love your neighbor as yourself.' There are no other commandments greater than these." And the scribe understood the simplicity of Jesus' statement. He understood that this idea, love of God and love of neighbor, was the very baseline for understanding doctrine, for understanding ethical decision-making, for understanding what it meant to be truly faithful in that tradition. And the idea of loving your neighbor that Jesus spoke about, 20th century and 21st century theologians have spent a lot of time trying to unpack, what does that mean? What does it mean to love your neighbor? And they reach conclusions like loving your neighbor means approaching them out of respect, giving them dignity, allowing them to have integrity, being in relationship with mutuality, meaning that I offer something to you, but I expect to be given something back, that we might both be transformed because of this relationship. And so when Jesus says, "Love your neighbor," the scribe, like the story in the Gospel of Luke says, didn't say, "But who is my neighbor?" The scribe knew, because the tradition of faith and the biblical witness makes it clear. In the Old Testament days, our neighbor was defined as the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, the poor, the slave. And that list is the same now as it was then, but we can continue to expand it. Who is our neighbor? The migrant, the homeless, victims of ecological and economic injustice, those who have been ravaged by disease, by war, by violence. Our neighbor even includes the political other, the person on the other side of the color divide that divides us politically. Is it the red? Is it the blue? When I was in Germany, I had many conversations over the breakfast table with pastors, with members of congregations, with everyday people of the German society and culture. And do you know how they opened conversation every morning at breakfast? Did you hear what your president did yesterday? And at first I thought that was kind of funny. No, I didn't hear, because your news is in German and I can't understand it and I can't read your newspaper, so no, tell me what he did. And they would. And then after several days, when I realized this was going to be a consistent theme for 10 solid days, I had to reflect myself to think that even if I were in the United States, I probably wouldn't know what my president did yesterday. And so I began to say to them, no, I don't know, because I've turned it off. I can't emotionally handle what's happening. I've had to distance myself from it because it's too hard. It's too hard to be politically engaged, and so I've kind of built a barrier around myself. And that opened the door for them to say, let me tell you about nationalism and populism in Germany today. Let me tell you what's happening in the former eastern side of Germany. Let me tell you what we're afraid of for you. And so I entered into a dialogue with my neighbor at the same time, knowing that I had a neighbor that I had seriously distanced myself from. So on this list of who is our neighbor from the Bible times, we have to admit that our political foes are our neighbors as well. So for the past 2 weeks, I had one of those experiences that changes a person, that changes your perspective on who you are in the world and who your church is in the world today. I was invited to dialogue with the German church, the Protestant Church of Baden, who is a formal partner of the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference. Now, as you know, Kansas-Oklahoma of the United Church of Christ is a very small judicatory. We're about 60 churches spread over 2 states. We have about 100 pastors who are active, retired, and serving in chaplain settings. And our official international partner is the Evangelische Landeskirche in Baden, the Protestant church in Baden, Germany. Baden is a region. It's not even one whole state. It's just part of a state. And the Protestant church there is united. So where we have Protestant churches all over our neighborhood, they have one Protestant church with many settings in their neighborhood. They have about 600 churches and about 1,000 pastors. And so their idea of being church is very different than our idea of being church. And I was invited to come for what became a cultural and ecclesiastical immersion. Before this trip, I've never been out of the United States. I had to get a passport so I could go on this extraordinary journey. I had studied a little bit of German in college, but just enough to know that I really didn't know what I was doing. And so here I found myself in a place, in a culture that was very familiar and very similar, but very different than anything I had seen before. And my official invitation was to participate in 2 conferences that the Judicatory was hosting. The first was called The Great Transformation. And that is how they have come to call their work responding to the environmental crisis, to climate change. And so we gathered in a small mountain setting, about 50 or 60 of us, to talk about what we were going to do, concrete action steps to address environmental justice in our local congregations. And then the second event was a conference on mission and dialogue. This is an event that they hold every 2 years, and its purpose is to engage in the ideas of defining what mission means, to define what it means to be ecumenical partners, to define what it means to be an interfaith dialogue. So from my context, when I hear the word mission, I have a pretty strong sense of what that means. Mission means the work. That's where our hands are active in the world. Mission is the good stuff that we go and we do, where we try to make the world a better place. But that only works in my mind because that's how I've been formed by the language that I speak. In other contexts, mission means the evangelistic outreach of the church. Mission means conversion. And so this was the great theological debate. Does mission mean we are sent to convert all the world to Christianity? Or does mission mean that we are called to walk on the way with the people of the world? And so we started with this academic paper from someone who was from a huge ecumenical institute in Switzerland, and he made this proposal that we adopt a common understanding of mission. Mission in the Protestant church in Germany should mean that we translate the Christian message, that we transmit that message, and that we open ourselves to transformation. Does that mean people of the world may choose to become Christian? Perhaps. But it means we are not forcing or explicitly inviting. We're simply opening a dialogue. And so as the U.S. partner, I was asked to speak on behalf of the United Church of Christ, Colonial Oklahoma Conference, Colonial Church, of all of these contexts in which I participate, to say what my experiences have been in interfaith dialogue. And let me tell you, I had a lot of homework to do. And so with the help of Google, I found the United Church of Christ position paper adopted in 2005. Did you know we had a mission paper on interfaith dialogue? So I looked it up, I absorbed it, and I learned we have a theological position, a historical background, a confession about what we have done wrong in the work of mission in the past, and an invitation for what it means for the church today. It states, from the United Church of Christ, to love my neighbor is to know my neighbor, not with the intent of changing them, but with the intent to care for them and love them in the way that Jesus taught. To love my neighbor is to respect their particularity and integrity with openness to the possibility of mutual transformation. So interfaith dialogue in our context is about the conversation. It's about learning and respecting each other's livelihoods and our cultures and opening ourselves to transformation. And so I showed him about our work here at Colonial Church, and I talked about our Tearing Down Walls event this past spring. And I talked about my accidental iftar that I shared with my Muslim neighbors in Lenexa. And through the course of my conversation, as my remarks concluded, the facilitator asked, you know, we've always heard here that America is this great melting pot. Do you think that's an image that still holds true? And I said, can I have a little while to think about that? And later in the day, I came back and I said, I've reflected on it, and no, melting pot doesn't work, and maybe melting pot never did work. It was an ideal, but I think it was flawed, because it presumed that what we came with, what we presented, wasn't worth holding on to, that could be done away with and something new might emerge. But that was flawed, because within this ideal of interfaith dialogue, we need to hold on to our cultural integrity. And so perhaps a new image that we want to talk about is the salad bowl. And they laughed at me because I was the big, loud American with funny words. The salad bowl, where the lettuce will always be the lettuce, and the cucumber will always be the cucumber, and the onion is going to bring a little spice to the party. But there's one thing that unites the salad, and that's the dressing. And they giggled again. I said, think about it. The salad dressing brings the flavor. The salad dressing brings it all together and takes vegetables and turns them into something else. And maybe, if we think about the dressing as the spirit that enables our dialogue and our work of mission, we have a new image to carry us forward. And they responded to that. And so as I reflected on these two conferences that I attended, one on ecology, one on mission and dialogue, it didn't take long to understand that my neighbors in the Protestant Church of Germany are so far more advanced than I have been in this theological work. That they are bringing understanding and ideas to life in local congregations while we are still debating whether climate change is real. They're so far ahead of us. And so that was a great challenge. The third official invitation I accepted was one that was very emotionally challenging. My last day that I was there, I was invited to visit a refugee resettlement camp. And I really had no idea what to expect. We traveled through Karlsruhe, which was the city I was staying in, to a former bank office building. It was a 4-story building, and it looks like a building you would see down on Metcalf Avenue. But it has been transformed. It is now a place for people to live. And when a refugee crosses the German border, they are sent to a resettlement center based on their origin. So the center in Karlsruhe was primarily inhabited from people from the Balkan nations. People from Syria were in a different part. People from Africa were in yet a different part. And so as I came, I expected to show my passport. I expected to be searched. I expected to be questioned. But as we arrived, I was greeted with a smile by the security guard. My church officers that I were traveling with told them who we were, that we had an appointment with the director of the facility. And he said, absolutely, come on in. And so we went and we signed in, and I was waiting for something scary to happen. And nothing scary happened. And the director came and she gave us a tour. First we saw the gymnasium where the children were playing. We saw their school where they were being taught the German language. We saw the dining hall where all the cuisines of the world were being prepared for lunch service. We saw the laundry facility, their thrift store, where aisle after aisle after aisle after aisle of items donated by the German people were made available. Clothing, toys, products for children and babies. We saw this bright, clean facility where people were welcomed in, welcomed as human beings with dignity, not turned to as someone who was illegal. And the emotional weight of that experience, it knocked me over. The people of Germany have a completely different perspective on what it means to be a refugee, of what it means to flee from war and what it means from violence. They have a historical understanding that they must do better for everything that has happened in their past. They have a saying, never again. You want to talk about World War II? Let's talk about it, honestly, frankly, and let us tell you, never again will the atrocities of war arise from this place. And so their education system, their culture, their society is turned toward peace. And so when a refugee arrives, they're welcomed. What's it like in America? And the tears came. It's not like this. And so it was a very humbling and emotional experience to see that my neighbors in the global context have so much to teach us about what it means to be a neighbor in this world. So those were the official events that I was participating in on behalf of the church. But I had one more experience that I want to share with you. As being a guest in the German culture, I understand German precision and engineering in a whole new way. When you arrive, you are handed a schedule. On this day, we're going to do 18 things. And on the second day, we're going to do 16 things. And on the third day, we're going to do 21 things. And so you have a full program, and you just go with the flow. You show up, you smile, you participate. So within my full 10-day experience, I had 2 hours by myself, 2 hours. And so I got to walk around Karlsruhe, which is a lovely, small European city. It's 300 years old. There's a castle at the center. It has radiating streets and courtyards. It's gorgeous, and it's walkable, and the public transportation is amazing, all of the things you would expect. And as I walked through this city, my host had been telling me all along, this city is 300 years old, it's a planned city, but you'll notice the architecture of that building is a little different. Like, yeah, that looks really modern. And they'd say, well, everything from that horizon for everything to that horizon, all of that was destroyed in the war. But we've rebuilt it. And they were very proud that we've rebuilt it. So on this day, when I had 2 hours to walk the streets, I went and I found myself a piece of kuchen. And I went to the park and I found a bench in the shade. So it was a little warm. And all I wanted to do was sit down and snap a picture of that piece of cake and send it to my sister in the Texas Panhandle and say, look, this looks like what Grandma used to make. Check this out. And so I'm sitting on the park bench and I'm taking my picture, and this older gentleman comes up and he sits down beside me and he says, hello, how are you today? He says it in German, right? Guten Tag, wie geht's? And I turned to him, I smiled and I nodded. I said, I'm good. I only speak English. Was? No Deutsch? No Deutsch. No Ruski? No Ruski. That's Russian. And that didn't stop him. He introduced himself. His name was Lev. He was born in Moscow. He was married for 48 years to a woman from Israel who is Jewish. They have 3 children. He has 5 grandchildren. They don't live in Karlsruhe. They live in a different city. He told me about what it was like to be a migrant coming to Karlsruhe when he was a younger man, what it's like when his grandchildren come to visit now. He asked me about world politics. What do you think about Putin? What do you think about Trump? And he agreed. The entire conversation where I talked about my husband, my stepsons, my family history, my German heritage was done without a common language. You can draw a number to figure out how old someone is. You can count your sons and your daughters. That works. So while I didn't understand him with my ears, I heard him with my heart. And that was a transformative moment. I have no common language with you, but I hear you, and I know you. I was so touched by that, and so inspired, knowing that this man, just sat down and started a conversation with this strange, loud, blonde American woman taking a picture of her cake. He taught me a little more about being a neighbor. So this full experience is one that I'm going to be processing for a very long time. It certainly has implications for me as an American citizen. It has implications for me as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It will have implications for the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference and my leadership role within the conference. It has shifted my perspective, not only on what it means to look for my neighbor, to value my neighbor, but it has expanded my idea of my neighborhood. I am a member of the neighborhood of Johnson County. I belong to the neighborhood of Kansas City. The people of the United States are my neighborhood. And now, the people of Southwest Germany are my neighbors. A man born in Moscow who speaks no English is my neighbor. A global perspective of the world and of church has suddenly opened in front of me. But this story isn't just about me and my experiences and finding my neighbors in a global context. This is truly a story for all of us. For all of us are called by Jesus and the biblical witness to love our neighbors as ourselves. All of us are invited to find our neighborhood and to live and work and play in such a way that we value all those who are around us. Finding our neighbors is about embracing Jesus' teaching about the commandment. Love God. Love your neighbor. Open yourselves to the transformation that the Spirit of God invites us to. So as we go today, I'm going to be humming a little tune. Maybe you'll whistle it with me throughout the afternoon. Maybe you'll wear your red cardigan tomorrow. As together, we find our neighbors in this neighborhood, a neighborhood that Jesus calls us to love one another and to be transformed by the Spirit of God. Amen.